Chapter 3. The officer saluted. "Countess, please forgive this intrusion, but I have come—" "Major Klug," the Countess said, advancing toward him and proffering her hand. "How good to see you again. I know why you have come. I think perhaps we should talk privately, don't you? But first, perhaps, your soldiers, their rifles, they are frightening the children." The major hesitated. He seemed at a loss for the moment as to how to deal with the situation. But he recovered quickly enough. "Very well, Countess, if you insist." He ordered the soldiers to lower their weapons, told us to stay right where we were, then followed the Countess into her study. I do not know how long we stood there in the hallway waiting, but it seemed like a lifetime. No one spoke. All the while I held Peter's hand, knowing these might be the last moments we would have together. Carly kept looking up at Muddy, his eyes filled with tears. But Muddy did not notice. Like all of us, she was straining to listen, to make some sense out of the murmur of voices we could all hear on the other side of that door. When at last the door opened, the major came out on his own. Without a glance at any of us, without a word, he strode swiftly across the hall towards the front door. He waited for a moment for a bewildered Hans to open it for him, and then left, his soldiers following him. The Countess came out moments later, a glass in her hand. She was breathing quite heavily. "I am afraid I have to have a little drink," she said, to stop myself shaking. She smiled at us then. "Do not look so worried. Actually, I think it all went quite well, better than I could have hoped for. It was lucky for us that it was Major Klug who came. He served with my husband in the same regiment. They knew each other quite well. Anyways, it is all over now. In the sense in which we needed him to be, he is, I am sure, an honorable man. He will keep his word. You are safe to go." "What do you mean?" Muddy asked her. "What did he say? What did you tell him?" "You have heard of the stick and the carrot," the Countess went on. "When you want to persuade someone to do something they do not wish to do, you need both, don't you? Stick and carrot. First, I used the stick. I reminded him that the Americans are maybe no more than a week or two away, that if anything happened to any of you, I would personally see to it, when they come, the Americans would know Major Klug was responsible, and that I would make quite sure he was shot. As for the carrot, I keep some money in my safe. Not much, but it helped. And just to be sure, I read him a few words from my husband's last letter from prison before they executed him. Major Klug had great respect for my husband. My husband wrote, and I know the words by heart, 'It makes me happy to know that out of the ashes of this horror, a new Germany must grow, and that you and our friends and family will be a part of it. Remember always the words of Goethe that I love. Whatever you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic. Begin it now. So begin the new Germany, my darling. Help it grow. I know you will. I am sad I will not be there to see it in person, but I shall always be with you in spirit.'" Major Klug seemed to take this very much to heart, as I hoped he would. When the time came to leave later that same night, the Countess kissed Carly and told him to behave himself, and then we were walking away from the house. By the time I turned to look, she had gone inside. Following along behind us were the choir school children in pairs, a sack on every back, and as silent as we were, Muddy walking with them. Peter went on ahead, our pathfinder as usual, while I led Marlene with Carly riding up on her, all of us knowing we owed our lives to that extraordinary and wonderful lady. It was hard to leave the warmth and comfort of the house behind us and be out there again, walking through the cold of the night. It took me a while to get used to the discomfort and the tiredness. In a way, the school children must have helped. They were a diversion, I suppose. I had little time now to worry about myself. Traveling was slower with them, of course. But we managed somehow to keep going. For the most part, it was Muddy and I who did our best to look after the choir school children, strictly rationing the food the Countess had given us, keeping them cheerful, encouraging and comforting them through their exhaustion and their fear and sorrow. But I am sure it was Marlene who was saving of them, because Marlene made them laugh. They loved to watch her splashing in the streams, loved to feed her by hand whenever they could, and, like Carly, loved to have a good giggle whenever they heard her. How can I say this politely? Letting off, which was often, and it was very smelly too. Carly grew up fast during those days and nights of hardship. There was no more showing off. I think maybe the compass incident, the disaster he had so nearly brought upon us that day, had changed him, made him more aware of other people. It was Carly's idea, for instance, that 2 of the choir school children should take it in turns to ride up with him on Marlene, one in front of him and one behind. It was the best of ideas because it gave them all something to look forward to, and that was so important. It kept their spirits up and ours too. Come to that, because it was very heartening to see the children enjoying themselves. It was not long, of course, before our supply of food ran out. For Peter, after that, it was like feeding of the 5,000, only he was no miracle worker. Whatever food he would bring back from his scavenging missions in the countryside, from his dawn raids of farmsteads, had been divided up between us all, and all too often there was very little to divide up. He told me he was having to take ever greater risks when it came to stealing food for us, and that dogs were his worst enemy. Once he was even shot at from an upstairs window. He had broken into some isolated farmhouse and was grabbing what he could from the kitchen when the farmer's dog attacked him, baying and barking like a wild thing. He had to drop everything and run. Luckily, the farmer did not shoot again, but the dog managed to sink his teeth into Peter's ankle, and that pained him for days afterwards. With the snow gone, early signs of spring were all around us by now, the trees building, the meadows and hedgerows dotted with flowers, and the birds sang. But there was rain, and often at night too. We trudged on through fields and forests, fording streams where we had to, following Peter, following his compass. But from those last weeks of our long journey into the night, I do not remember so much the tiredness, nor the cold and the wet, nor the aching hunger we were all living with the whole time now. What I remember best was the children singing. I think it probably started as one of Muddy's ideas to keep them happy, to keep their minds occupied. And once they began singing, they did not seem to want to stop. They sang as we marched along, lightening the darkness for all of us. They sang, crammed together in some shepherd's hut, in some forester's shed, huddling together for warmth. And when they sang, sooner or later we joined in. We loved that, loved being a part of their music making. We were singing away our fears and doing it together. We must have been a strange sight for those who caught sight of us. Peter and I stomping along together ahead, an elephant behind us with 2 or 3 children aboard, and, following them, Muddy and her cavalcade of singing children. Carly was getting on so well with the other children by now that often he would get down off Marlene and walk along with them, singing with them. I think he did not want to be left out. He wanted to feel he was one of them. It could not be true to say all of this singing meant we could not entirely forget our discomforts, our hunger, and our anxieties, but it most certainly helped us put one foot in front of the other. As the days and nights passed, there was something else that lifted our spirits and gave us new hope. We were no longer hearing the sound of guns behind us. They were ahead of us now, lightening the western horizon every night. American artillery, Peter told us. That put a real spring in our step, but at the same time we knew that no guns were friendly guns, even if they were American. We were still in grave danger. More often than not now, we found ourselves sharing whatever shelter we could find with other refugees, and often with dozens of retreating German soldiers, too, which made us all very nervous. But we need not have worried. They were all far too exhausted and too depressed to ask questions. They all loved to make a fuss of Marlene, and I think it helped also to have the children with us. Even the soldiers seemed happy to share what little food they had. It is true also that once or twice someone did steal our food while we were sleeping, but then it would be fair to say that Peter had stolen it in the first place, I suppose. Peter made himself very popular with everyone because whenever he came back from one of his successful scrounging quests, he would share out all that he could. The soldiers were encountered came with stories like everyone else, and all their stories told one tale, that Americans were very close now, that they were breaking through everywhere, and that the armies could be over the next hill. But it still came as a surprise to us on that day when we first met up with the Americans. We were late finding our shelter that morning, but Peter was not too worried because there was a thick mist all around us, and we were well enough hidden. But of course, that made it all the more difficult to spot a likely barn or shed where we could lie up for the day. I remember we were making our way uphill, the early morning mists thinner now and whisper than before. All the children were singing, Carly too, walking along with them. I was leading Marlene by the ear, talking to her as I often did when she suddenly stopped and lifted her head. Ahead of us, Peter had stopped too and was holding up his hand. For just a moment or two, I thought he had found us a shelter, but I couldn't see it. There was no barn, no shed, only trunkless trees rising strangely out of the mist. The children had fallen silent. We all stood there bewildered at the terrifying crescendo of sound we were now hearing. It seemed to be coming from all around us, roaring, rattling, creaking, clanking, and it was coming closer all the time. The ground itself was shaking under our feet. Then out through the mist they came. Tanks! 20 or 30 of them, and they kept on coming. Americans, Peter shouted. They are Americans! And he began waving at them frantically and running towards them. That was when Marlene took a fright. She pulled away from me and fled. I went after her, calling and calling for her to come back, but her run became a charging stampede. Trumpeting in her terror, her ears flapping wildly, her trunk flailing, she simply disappeared into the mist. By the time the lead tank reached us, they had all lurched to a stop. A soldier's head came up out of the turret. He pulled off his headphones and stared at us in disbelief. I shall never forget the first words he said to us. Holy cow, what in the hell's name was that? Was that an elephant? It was, Peter told him. We sure are glad to see you. You American, the soldier asked. Canadian, Peter replied. RAF, Flight Sergeant Peter Cam, navigator, shot down over Dresden a few weeks back. You walked all the way from Dresden, the soldier asked, still incredulous. With an elephant and all those kids? Yep, said Peter. Holy cow, the soldier said. Well, I'll be damned. We have to find the elephant, Peter told him. We have to go after her. She has been with us all the way. Don't you worry, the soldier assured us cheerily. We will find her for you. Nowhere much an elephant can go without being noticed, I'd say. But right now, you guys have to get out of here. This is a war going on, you know? Muddy tried to argue with him to let her go after Marlene. Carly and I begged him too. Muddy told him that Marlene would just keep on running, that she would be terrified, and that no one would be able to catch her except one of us. She knew only us. She trusted only us. But the soldier would not listen. We were all led away, still protesting, by an escort of soldiers. Muddy was inconsolable. I think she knew then that she would never see Marlene again. So at the moment of our greatest triumph, we had lost Marlene. For days, for weeks, we never stopped looking for her, asking after her, but no one had seen her. It was as if she had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. At this point in the story, Lizzie stopped and looked at us as if to say, that's it, that's the end. And what happened? Carl was echoing my thoughts exactly. What happened after that? To Marlene, to all of you? Did you find her in the end? And Poppy, did Poppy come home? What happened afterwards? Lizzie replied. Oh, a lot happened, a whole lifetime of happenings. But I think I shall keep it in short. I am suddenly rather tired, and you must be too. Well, here is how the story ends. Within a day or two of meeting the Americans, we found ourselves, Muddy, Carly, and me, and the choir schoolchildren, in a camp, a sort of refugee camp, for displaced persons. That was what they called us. Peter did all he could to stop them from taking us away. He told them how Muddy has helped him to escape, told them how the whole story. But the rules were rules, they said, and that was that. All displaced Germans were being gathered up into camps.